In spite of the locked doors, Jesus came and stood in their midst. I visited him monthly. Retired, shut in. I would go to his place where he lived and I would knock on the door, bringing with me the real presence of Christ found in the Eucharist and having the opportunity to look forward to our visits. And as I knocked on the door, I would wait to hear the shuffle on the other side. And then, one by one, the locks were opened. First, the lock on the doorknob. I could hear him reach and turn it. And then there was the deadbolt that had to be turned as well. And finally, there was the chain. The chain that you could hear sliding across and dropping to the door sill, and then the door would open. And on the other side, a frail elderly man would welcome me in. In spite of the locked door, Jesus came and stood in their midst. For a long time, actually since Pope, now St. John Paul II, declared the second Sunday of Easter Divine Mercy Sunday, I've tried to get an image of what divine mercy looks like. And certainly lots of different images come to mind wherever there is mercy that is dealt out, of course, whether it be in one of the corporal works of mercy that are ours as a church, or simply whether it's being attentive to another. Why, there's lots of images you and I can have of what divine mercy might look like. But today, on this second Sunday of Easter, for the very first time this past week, as I was sitting with this gospel passage, it dawned on me that maybe, just maybe, what divine mercy looks like is this. In spite of the locked door, Jesus came and stood in their midst. It's a beautiful image. If you and I would just give a couple of minutes to think about that. After all, Jesus comes and he stands in the midst of the disciples. He doesn't stand apart from them. He doesn't make his dwelling from a distance, but in his resurrected form, as he is given new life through the gift of the resurrection, he comes and he stands in the midst of them. The same motley crew that scattered, the same motley crew that betrayed and denied and simply wanted nothing to do with him in his greatest hour of need. Jesus had every reason to come to those disciples and give them a piece of his mind. But he didn't. Instead, he gave them a piece of his heart by choosing to simply come and stand in their midst and give to them the gift of peace. Divine mercy, my friends, looks like that. It looks like whenever you and I, as followers, disciples of Jesus Christ, choose to stand in the midst of our sisters and brothers who are wounded, who are hurt, who are troubled, who are fearful. Because after all, isn't that how the doors get locked? Aren't the doors of our hearts and of our lives locked because there's fear, and that fear takes on many different names and faces and images. Why, there's the fear of not being understood, there's the fear of failure, there's the fear of rejection, there's the fear of getting angry, there's the fear of, well, the list can go on and on. And the fears, our initial reaction to them is to shut the door. And not only shut it, but lock it, not once, not twice, but maybe even 3 times. Because deep within us, there are those fears. And the beautiful thing is, God's divine mercy is such that why He chooses to come in spite of the locked doors, in spite of the fears that you and I have, that this life affords you and I. Jesus comes and He stands in the midst of them. He stands right smack dab in the center of all the fears that prevent us from loving freely, that prevent us, like Thomas, from believing in the risen one, those fears that prevent you and I from taking our fingers in our hands and placing them in the wounds of those who hurt, and those who struggle, and those who wander, and those who even wonder what their purpose in life truly is. And so you and I on this Divine Mercy Sunday are called not only to recognize that this risen Christ chooses to stand and to be present in our midst, but you and I then are likewise called, like Thomas was, to be attentive with our eyes and with our entire being of the risen Christ who comes in spite of the locked doors. Because you and I, truth be told, we have shut doors on all kinds of different people in our lives. We are convinced and we are certainly certain that certain relationships are just no longer worthwhile. And so we become dismissive, and we become people who simply want to put an end to those chapters, to those relationships. But might divine mercy be calling you and I to a different self, to a different way of seeing others, to a different way of living in the midst of our brothers and sisters? Could the resurrected Christ remind us, as it should, that resurrection does not mean that Jesus is apart from us, but rather resurrection means that Jesus is now in our midst, but He's in our midst in a new way, in a new resurrected way, in a new brilliant way, in a way that calls you and I, as it called Thomas, to see, to believe, to do whatever is necessary. Certainly, if it even requires you and I taking our hands and placing them inside the wounds of our sisters and brothers in Christ who mourn, who grieve, who search, who want to know the direction in life, so that you and I, through the gift of God's divine mercy, might become that community of believers that the Acts of the Apostles talks about in our first reading today, a community of believers who were of one mind and one heart. Notice that reading tells us that it's not our work to give each other a piece of our mind, but rather to be of one mind and of one heart, so that we might share everything in common, the most important thing being Jesus, who in spite of the locked door stands in our midst.